lot of time product managers, they have this like mental model for research is like trying to find insights, like little nuggets of gold that tell you exactly what to do. And I don't really have that mental model anymore. Like I see research as being more of an intuition building exercise. It's more about like really building intuition that comes from firsthand empathy and understanding of your user and putting yourself in their shoes enough times where like you basically can stand in as a proxy for your users and a very like high fidelity proxy. So that's level 2. You're actually doing good generative research. And then level 3 is you're recording all those calls and you're sharing them with your organization to the point where you could help not just you build that intuition and that good proxy as users, but your entire product team.
Welcome to another episode of the Supra Insider podcast. This time, Mark and I sit down with Jeff Whitlock, who's the CEO of Grain. Grain is a call recording software company. They allow you to record your calls, create highlights, share those with your teammates, and then they're building in a bunch of really exciting AI summary capabilities into the product. Jeff is someone who I met on LinkedIn after I started using Grain. So I fell in love with Grain as a product, and then I decided I want to see who this team is that's building this product. Mark and I have a deep appreciation for people that do really good product work, and I think Jeff has proven that he's capable of steering a company into building something that's quite intuitive in a increasingly crowded space of call recording software. So we're really excited to go in and chat with Jeff.
Yeah, it was a fun episode, and we talked both about professional and personal topics. We started by talking about how the best product teams are using call recording software to keep their teams on the loop, why Jeff's product background makes him a more effective CEO. We also talked about how Grain prioritizes building an intuitive software in a space that's very crowded, and also his philosophy for killing features that no longer make sense to keep around. Another fun one that we shared was how Jeff creates space to be a good dad while running a company as a CEO, and how he finds that ideal work-life balance. And then we finished by talking about how the Utah tech scene is really exploding, and Jeff's take on why that is.
We're really grateful Jeff took the time to chat with us and hope you enjoy listening to this conversation. All right, we're live. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Super excited to be here.
Yeah. So when we were thinking about some guests that we want to bring on, Mark and I started talking about wanting to bring people on that are potentially building some of the products that we really love using as users. And Grain has been one of those products for me. I got exposed to it for the first time when I was interviewing with Continuum, and Nolan, the CEO, shared complete open access, like all you can eat, to their Grain as a team. And I got to watch team meetings and just like discussions and show and tells. And it really helped me get a better sense for the culture of the team before I joined. So when I joined, it felt like I was jumping into something that was more of a known entity. And then we used it for customer interviews when I was there and all kinds of internal decision making. And we used it for sales calls as well. So I just really love the product and how simple it is relative to some of the other tools out there. So I just want to say, really excited to chat with you because I'm a huge fan of the product. And the first question I'd love to get your thoughts about is just like thematically, you're getting to see how many different teams are doing the thing I just described using call recording software. And I'd love to get a sense for how are the best product teams using Grain and other types of call recording software and the insights that are now generated through AI to make better decisions.
Yeah. First of all, I love that use case. That's a really amazing one. I haven't heard that one before, honestly. It takes a lot of, I love it. It's like takes a lot of confidence to open up like that to a high, like a candidate, but I love it. Like just that organization must have some really great transparency, which is amazing.
That's for sure true. If you meet Nolan, that's definitely one of the first traits that will stick out about him is he's a very transparent leader, which I definitely loved. Yeah.
So to answer your question about what are we seeing some of the best product teams do, I think, first of all, like the thing that I would say is really important, which sounds so obvious, but talking to their customers, I think the one thing like we can't get as a call recording company or conversational intelligence company, we can't make people do that. And those are really the most high value conversations. Typically, people will use Grain to record user testing, feedback conversations. I think the really valuable ones are there's what I call generative user research, where you're really going deep with a customer and trying to understand more than just like what they think about your product, but really what's important to them. What are their goals? What are their objectives? What trade-offs are they making? What matters to them? What do they worry about? Just like getting a lot deeper than I think oftentimes people will get in just like feedback conversations where it's all about the product. I didn't like that your product does this. And well, why don't you like it? Oh, because this. Oh, okay, we'll fix that for you. Thanks. So that's what first of all, what the best teams are doing is actually having deep conversations with customers. I think there's probably like 3 levels. Like level 0 is like you're not talking to customers, or maybe you are, but it's just the researchers, like PMs aren't doing it. And this happens a lot. I see this. My last startup, actually, we served PMs. PMs were our customers. What I used to say back then was I said, like, the dirty secret in product management is that product managers actually don't talk to their customers. They're usually like running meetings and facilitating people who talk to customers, like designers and researchers, but aren't actually doing it themselves as much as they ought to be, if at all. So that's like level 1 is talk to your customers. Level 0 is not talk to. Level 1 is you're talking to your customers. Level 2 is you're talking to your customers, and you're having, it's going beyond just simple feedback conversations into generative stuff. And the goal to me around generative research is not like, I think a lot of times I used to be in this boat, and I think I've evolved on this. Like a lot of time product managers, they have this like mental model for research is like trying to find insights, like little nuggets of gold that tell you exactly what to do. And I don't really have that mental model anymore. Like I see research as being more of an intuition building exercise. It's more about like really building intuition that comes from firsthand empathy and understanding of your user and putting yourself in their shoes enough times where like you basically can stand in as a proxy for your users and a very like high fidelity proxy. So that's level 2. You're actually doing good generative research. And then level 3 is you're recording all those calls and you're sharing them with your organization to the point where you can help not just you build that intuition and that good proxy as users, but your entire product team. So that's how I think about it.
That makes a ton of sense. And one quick follow-up is I've definitely seen some people overly rely on their cross-functional partners to do user research, and that has never sat well with me because I think it's important to build your own conviction, and it's hard to build your own conviction about what people want without like watching their body language literally evolve in real time as you're describing new ideas or asking them questions. Like that firsthand exposure is critical. And I've tried my best to try to spread that knowledge to the rest of my team by sharing, like I use Grain's like highlighting feature, maybe now you call it clipping or clips.
Yeah.
And now you could copy all those and share them internally in like a Slack message or something. And I've done that with teams. And I guess I'm curious, do people watch this stuff? Do they consume it the way that the people who are the power users of Grain and sharing all this information intend them to? Or do you find that there's like a real obstacle to overcome with getting people to really engage with these takeaways from the research, like the highlights?
What we've seen is people don't typically engage with recordings. Not to say they don't, but it's just a little harder. The barrier is higher. If you say, oh, I just had this awesome call with this customer, go watch this 45-minute interview, less likely that people are going to watch the whole thing. They'll open it and maybe they'll that's one of the reasons why we have AI notes and transcript is to create a map of the call that people can sometimes use to navigate. So I'll say people will do that, like they'll peruse it a little bit, but highly unlikely they're going to watch the whole thing. And so that's why we have that clips feature is so you can pull out the key moments, and people do definitely engage with that. If I say, hey, these are the 3 moments of this call, each one's 45 seconds, like people will do that, but it requires some curation. And I think that's one of the things that I think maybe it's funny coming from CEO of an AI company, but that's one of the things I think the promise of AI is a little bit overhyped right now. And maybe not even just overhyped, but the expectations are such where they probably shouldn't even be delivered against. And not to say, who knows, things are moving so fast, I don't know where things are going to go, but I think people want AI to do things that they should do themselves, or they want to help AI cut corners that you probably shouldn't cut. Like again, at the end of the day, AI is not going to tell you the answer to a lot of things from a user research. What AI can do is point you to where you should look, and or maybe flag and say, hey, this is interesting, take a look at it. Or maybe that's how I see AI's job, is like someone who's like there to guide you. But at the end of the day, like if you're not actually spending time with your customers, whether it's by watching their words through a highlight or a clip, or watching a call, or talking directly, it's going to be really hard again to build that judgment and that intuition. Like AI is not going to be able to give that to you, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And a challenge that is very common in the community is a product leader goes to a meeting with the CEO and they're like, hey, like we really need to build this AI feature. We need to have AI in our pricing page so we can compete against this other company that's close to us. And I think what happens with that behavior, one of the top as PMs to incorporate AI, is that you end up just building AI features for the sake of building AI features without delivering much value. So I'm curious, do you have any frameworks that you use when you think about, hey, like what use case can I enhance with AI in the product? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a framework, but some principles. Before I answer that question directly, like one thought I would say is like, not to say that I don't think AI can help. AI can definitely help. It's just that I think that people are trying to get AI to do things that are fundamentally wrong. I'm already seeing people, not necessarily in exactly our space, but like adjacent spaces of like, give us all your customer feedback across email, reviews, support, and we'll tell you the answers. I just don't believe that. I think it can help. Again, I see AI as being a really smart, I don't want to use the assistant word because that implies something else, like a really smart, maybe like junior level data analyst that can say, hey, here's some broad trends, take a look. That's actually a good metaphor, I'd say, because if you're a good product leader and you have a product analyst come and reading a report and you just listen to the report and then make decisions, you're probably not a good product leader. It's the same thing with AI. Like AI should help you understand some trends, but if you're not actually going in and getting the root data yourself and building a point of view by wrestling with the data, probably, in my opinion, not the right way to approach it. So anyway, looping back to your question, what is the right way how we think about building AI into the product? So our three primary personas are we salespeople, product, which includes product managers, design and researchers, and then customer success. And we have a point of view for each of those three personas of what is the core thing that person's great at that we don't think AI should automate, can't automate, it's not ideal. And then basically, then we say, okay, so these are the things that we're not going to try to automate because that's just our point of view on how these jobs work. And then we want to say, well, how can we make those jobs, basically two things, either make it easier to do that by pointing them in the right direction, by giving them signals, or taking away other things so they can spend more time on the thing that they are really good at. So to make it less theoretical, I'll just use sales, even though I know this isn't necessarily a sales podcast, but we think salespeople should be spending time with customers, understanding their needs deeply, and selling. We don't ever believe a world where AI is going to be selling to people. Maybe I could be wrong, but I don't believe in that world. So we want to help salespeople do more actual face-to-face conversations with their clients. So what can we automate away? Well, we can automate taking the notes. We can auto updating the CRM after the meeting. Maybe we can help augment the follow-up. So that's how we think about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I still get a little bit freaked out when I see a recorder join a call.
Yeah.
Either when I'm in an internal meeting or maybe just an external meeting, I'm like, ooh, I definitely feel like I'm editing myself a little bit more and I'm being more conscious. And I'm curious if you're seeing that trend too. And do you think that's just going to go away and people are going to get used to it? Or how do you think about that?
I mean, it's a good point. It's a good question. I'm biased. My point of view is that it's usually initial response, then people get really used to it. And I think that's probably the way things are going to be going, at least for high value conversations, like conversations where work is being done in the conversation. I think there's just so much value that can be had from recording that conversation that it's going to continually just be the way that business is done. That being said, I think there's sensitive conversations. Like we'll remove grain from a lot of certain types of conversations where we know, hey, this needs to just be off the record. So I think it'll probably be more of maybe a model of talking to a reporter or something, where some meetings will be off the record, others will be on the record, and you just get more comfortable with it. I actually would say though, there's a lot of the meetings, like people will use grain to record internal meetings, and it sounds like Ben in your first story, that's what they were doing. And we're fine with that use case. That's great. People do that. We record our internal meetings. Grain, though, is primarily built for external meetings, these high value conversations you're having with your customers. And I would actually say, as long as your customer is not uncomfortable, although that happens and that's something that we're worried about, I'd say it's actually good that you're recorded because in some ways it makes you up your game. When I'm doing a sales call, I know I'm being recorded and I'm like, oh, people in the company are going to be able to see this call. I need to stay fully attention and be focused. And so
that's such a good point.
So, to be honest, I think a lot of these customer interactions, I'm not saying you should be disingenuous, but in some ways you're performing. You know what I mean? It's almost like a sport. In sales, in customer interviews, like you should show up like you're performing, and why not record it if you're performing?
That's a really good point. I've actually thought, since we started the pod, Mark, I've thought a few times about how I feel like all those grain recordings that I did were like good practice for podcasting, because you do develop the same need to be fully present, to really listen, and then you start developing the mindfulness of what people might think when they listen later to the conversation. So I think that is very valuable. And I do think there's a lot that's lost when you don't record internal or external conversations for that matter. But I used to tell every person I recorded a call with when I was doing like user research or any sort of external conversations, like, I can turn this thing off anytime. This is here. And as long as we say stuff that you're comfortable with my team being able to know about later, then I'll keep it on. And if at any point you feel like you're holding back because this is recorded, I'm going to turn this thing off immediately because I care way more about us having a real conversation than capturing everything you say.
Yeah.
So I think there's ways you could mitigate the awkward factor a little bit by just leaning into calling it out for what it is.
And I also love the personal development use case, like especially like for PMs, right? If you're a junior PM, maybe you're doing the first 10 research calls on your own. And I think it'd be a great artifact to then go back to your manager and be like, hey, here are the research calls that I've done. Do you have any feedback? Because I think a lot of times, like I've definitely been in that position where I have a research call and I got some insights, but it's hard to know what I could have done better.
Yeah, totally.
So I think that's a really cool use case as well.
Yeah, I have a coach who's, I wouldn't necessarily call them an executive coach, but they're like a strategic personal advisor. Maybe advisor is a better word. As CEO, I'll do a lot of generative user research where I'm talking to customers, and he'll watch my calls and say, you should have pulled on that thread. That was a really interesting thread. Hey, you missed asking this follow-up. You lost the script a little bit here. It's very useful for personal development. I feel like I've gotten a lot better at doing generative research from just the cycles of doing research, recording it, and then having someone who's really good at it giving me feedback on it.
Yeah. I know a lot of people in tech and probably outside of tech too just view themselves as athletes who just don't play sports. They treat their career as athletes. And when I think of the best athletes, everyone watches tape. They watch the last game. They want to know how they can do better. And so for me, like watching myself interview a customer often did feel like watching tape and making sure that I didn't make the same mistakes again. So it's a resource. Transitioning gears a little bit. So I think before you were the CEO of Grain, you were the head of product at Grain, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And we recently had on Nan Yu, who's the head of product at Linear, and we talked about how in competitive spaces, leaning into design can really help differentiate a product relative to the other players in the space. And I certainly see the meeting recording space heating up. There's more competitors. I've tried a few of the other tools. I hate to admit it, but what I'm happy to admit is I still like Grain better. So after trying a few other tools, I've stuck with it. And I think one of the reasons is that the design is so simple. You've built a very intuitive product that kind of gets out of the way for me. And where I felt like a lot of the other products that I've used, like Otter or Read, they feel like they get in the way a little bit for me personally. How do you make sure that as you're in this competitive space where you're competing for deals with companies that maybe have more quote unquote like bloated software, that the product doesn't start to feel bloated?
Oh man, that's a big issue. Honestly, it's one we're struggling with now. So I wouldn't say I have a great answer, but I would say that we spend a lot of time circling back over the terrain. I think maybe what happens sometimes, and I feel this tension a lot in a hot space, is like people are shipping new features, and especially in the world of AI, because like you could do this with AI, you could do this with AI, you could do this. And so we'll see our competitors launch something and we'll feel like a little bit of FOMO and say, oh, maybe we should build that feature. And while we still trying to add new value and new experiences through this amazing capability that's constantly growing, we always dedicate a pretty large lane to what we call enhancing the current product. And that's like almost like a fixed work lane where we're just like constantly going back through and saying, okay, we let this area of the product get a little crufty. We need to clean it up. This feature no one uses, kill it. This experience, we don't like it anymore, fix it. And so we're constantly doing that. Are we doing it in the right amount? I'm feeling that tension right now as we speak, because there's a few areas of the product I noticed where I'm just like, it's not as clean as I'd like. And so I think it's all a constant battle, and I wouldn't say there's a great answer, but those are some thoughts. And one last thought I'll share on that topic is I think it's actually hard to build a really good web app. If one or two people aren't highly empowered to consistently make it cleaner, it can really decay over time. It doesn't have to come from leadership. It can come from product, but having some sponsors that like are committed to keeping the app a good experience, and just like putting the resource behind doing that.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. And I guess like one quick follow up on that is, how do you decide like when to kill something in the product? Because I'm guessing like as you start to run up into potential concerns around the product getting bloated and crowded, there's times where you may want to kill certain features. And I personally have just developed this perspective that teams are just so scared of killing features in my experience. It's always hard to kill stuff. I've tried killing features that people just cling on to. There's almost like some hoarding psychology that seems to
for sure.
underlie it. What's your
Yeah.
take on like when to kill a feature?
I'd say there's a couple things. One is obviously if no one's using it, that's easy. So that's the first one. There should be some threshold of users that should be using a feature. And if it's not, like even after you've tried a few times to make it better. So that's one. The second is like the strategic. So there's like the usage lens, there's a strategy lens. Do we see this feature actually helping us win within segments or among customer bases? There might be times where you'll ship a V1 or a V2 and it's not getting usage, but you're like, this is a strategic feature for us and we still believe in it. So we're going to stay the course. And then I think the third lens I'll look at is honestly just taste. I think Linear talks a lot about taste. I think there's some times where you have to trust your gut where it's like, this feature, it's not good. It's not worth reinvesting in making it good. Someone's impression of your product is probably determined by its worst feature in many cases, especially if it's prominent. And so if you feel like this feature is just bringing down the average and by cutting it, everything else is up here, I think sometimes you just have to make a leadership call and do it. We had this feature where we called favorites, where like people were able to heart little highlights and even meetings as favorites. And people used it, like it was well used and lot, but I was just like, we have so many, and I just ultimately was like, we didn't, like, first of all, this feature isn't that good. We didn't build it that well. We have so many ways people can organize their stuff. Like we have tags and we have folders. It's like, why do we need favorites as like another one? I could create a tag called favorites if I want to. So I ended up getting rid of it. And I thought not a single person cared.
That's a really good example.
Yeah.
Because I remember I used to hover over every thumbnail in Grain and I would always see that little heart that's there. And I'm like, it's taking up space. It's always making me wonder, should I be favoriting stuff? What's the use case for favoriting stuff? Am I missing out? And like you said, I never even used tags because I felt like even tags were a little bit like too much for what I needed to do because I was like hand picking things and I was very like tactical. But that's a really good example. I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Another question I have for you, and this is something that I experienced when I was at Asana, is that one of the tricky things about building a tool that's very horizontal, and by I mean by is used by a lot of different functions, is that sometimes you're in this awkward position where you have to prioritize kind of one persona or department versus the other. What do you do when that happens? And how do you keep like the product team focused on that big picture?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. Again, there's probably different approaches, but the way I think about it is what's our strategy? What's our theory on how Grain wins in the market? And usually that strategy will involve some prioritization of those personas or some sort of theory about how you land with a persona and expand to others. Or when push comes to shove, this persona is the persona that wins. So you'll have some beliefs about that sort of guide your strategy. And then from there, I think from the company strategy, your product strategy should follow. So that's largely how we do it. And so like our belief is while we, like I said, our three primary personas, our product, sales, and CS, we ultimately believe at the end of the day that if sales rips us out, it's a lot harder for us to stay long-term in an organization. So on the margins, we do prioritize sales. And in some ways that's made products suffer a little bit. And because I'm a product person, I'm always cognizant of, so there's a delicate balancing act there, but I think it's healthy tension.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about this transition that you've made from head of product to CEO. We know a lot of folks in the community are moving up into further executive roles. Some folks are looking to become founders. Some folks are getting into more like advising, consulting. I don't think I've recently seen any examples of folks in the community making the transition from head of product to CEO, but I wouldn't be surprised if I see that come up in the next 3 to 6 months, because it certainly strikes me that a product-focused company could benefit very well from having someone running the company who is product-minded and maybe less go-to-market minded. I'm not saying you're not go-to-market minded, but as a head of product, I'm guessing that's a superpower of yours. Why do you think we don't see more B2B SaaS companies led by product-minded CEOs?
It's a good question. As you ask it, I'm thinking like, okay, let me think of some examples. Like actually Linear is a good one. I think like the CEO of Linear is a designer by background.
Yep.
But I think you're right. I think it's probably less than you'd imagine. Although I will say like a lot of the founders that I knew, like when I went through Y Combinator, did have product backgrounds. So I think my guess would tell me maybe it's just a matter of time. Maybe in another few years, all the sort of the cohort of companies, the vintage year around like 2018 to 2021, as they start to become well-known companies, you'll see more CEOs in that space. If I had to play armchair theorist, I think distribution in SaaS companies is really hard, especially as the market gets more crowded. Distribution is really hard. You could argue it's harder than product, to be honest. I think that's not true in consumer. I think consumer product is incredibly hard, and finding a product that nails it is like catching lightning in a bottle a little bit. I think in SaaS, it's a little more straightforward because there's like some functional job. People buy our product to X. And not to say emotion doesn't matter. It really does. You should understand your buyer's emotions. But it's a little more straightforward, I feel like. It's a little bit easier, like I was saying earlier, to build that intuition, to understand the job. The personas are a bit tighter because it's like a persona is a sales manager, this type of company. Whereas if you're doing a consumer persona, it can be really hard, you know what I mean? Sometimes to really nail that persona. There's so many different variables. So maybe in enterprise SaaS, the consumers that are amazing at distribution are the ones that win because that's usually like one of the hardest things. But I'm not 100% sure about that. That's just a theory.
I'm curious what parts of being the head of product you miss and what parts of being a CEO you really enjoy.
What I miss about being the head of product is to be able to I really enjoy just spending long periods of time talking to customers, working on features. I really miss that. I was a very hands-on head of product. I know everyone has a different product leadership style. For me, every single big feature, not every feature, because there's some features where it's like, hey, we're improving a settings. And like those ones, like sometimes I'll just do a design review. I'll see it in a design review and then sign off on it and it'll go out. But any big feature, I want to be involved in the design process. I want to riff along with the designers, with the PM working on it. Obviously, it's not like I'm trying to control every part of the process, but I really like being involved and hands-on and part of the creative process. Have a lot less opportunity to do that as a CEO. I still try, but it's just once a week instead of a few times a week. What I like, that's probably the main thing. It's also nice at the end of the day to not have the final buck stop with you on everything. That's probably, not to say you don't take on a lot of responsibility as head of product, but there's like another level of, I'd say, responsibility that I think can create like this ambient stress where it's just like, oh, I'm responsible for everything. And if something's wrong, like I have to help solve that problem. And what I like better is to be able to coordinate the pieces of the business. I think in enterprise SaaS, there's a lot of benefit of having sales, customer success, support, and product being really tight together. Organizationally, that's very hard to do. I always see one or two of those groups just drifting. And sometimes I've seen them completely severed where there's very little data being shared back and forth. Or if there is, it's only one way. It's a one-way projection. Like product says, hey, support, we're launching this feature in 2 weeks. So as CEO, though, I really like keeping that tight and having data streams come to me from all directions and then being able to synthesize those viewpoints in a helpful way. So I think that's my favorite thing.
And that skill set around helping you coordinate those different parts of the business, is that something that product prepared you well for? And if not, like how did you learn how to do that?
Oh yeah, totally. Product helped a lot because when you're a product manager and you're like, man, I really wish the salespeople would do X, Y, and Z. As a CEO, you're like, hey, this is what I wanted. This is the process I'm going to help create, or like the data I'm going to get. So I think it definitely helped. Yeah, to make it more specific, I think every product person who works in enterprise sales should know that like sales has a great insight, right? They have on the ground understanding like why customers are buying and not buying. Sometimes what happens though is like the way that insight gets communicated is like it doesn't get communicated at all, or it's like a very one-off demand. Like I need X feature to close Y deal. And I feel like from a product background into the CEO role, I just have a little bit better ability to essentially suss out that insight and then push it to product or even make some of the product calls myself. So that's been good.
Love it. And also, I was looking at your LinkedIn and I love that you had your family as a position.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Important position.
Yeah, very arguably the most important position. Something that I think a lot of product leaders struggle is being a present father or a present mother, and also doing really well at their job. And I'm sure you've had to figure out this even more as a CEO. So I'm curious, like, do you have any tricks on how you create some boundaries for yourself and find that good work-life balance while also probably working really hard as well?
Yeah, I think this is a perennial tension. There's no, like, I think answer. There are answers if you say, my job just pays the bills and I'm going to work 9 to 5. And I think that's fine. I don't denigrate that at all. I think where it's always a challenge is people who maybe go above and beyond because they love their work, they're passionate about it. They feel like that marginal effort actually drives value. Like the thing that I really struggle with is if I say, okay, I'm done at pick an arbitrary time, I'm done. I always feel like, oh man, but if I did this later tonight, like I'll skip a whole, and I'm always thinking about this, especially as like from my product background, it's like, man, if I just send this loom to Dave, our designer in England, he'll have a rev done by tomorrow morning and I can review it. I personally can just make the system work so much faster by not being, because I'm often the bottleneck. So I feel that pressure a lot, and that's tough. So that's where I think it's really hard. So I wouldn't say there's definitive answers, but I'll tell you some things that work for me. I have this belief in business and in parenting and most areas of my life that like not all times created equal. And there's a way where this principle can be abused, and there's a downside of that principle I could talk about, but I'll tell you the principle. The principle is basically that like certain times are more important than other times, and you have to have good judgment on when the important times are and lean in the important times. And then when they're not as important, that's where you maybe lean out a little bit. That's, like I said, that's both true in parenting, and I think it's also true in life. So for example, like last night, my daughter had a recital. She does ballet. I knew that like me being early for that recital and like cheering her on beforehand, me staying through the whole thing, even though she had one number out of the 30. And I was like, could I leave early? I was really feeling pressure to leave. But being there at the end, like saying like, great job, honey, taking her to dinner afterwards, I know that matters to her. And that probably honestly buys me. So it's like, we don't hang out tomorrow. It's not the biggest deal in the world. And not to say that I only go to the important things, but making sure I'm showing up when it matters, I think is probably my number one principle to try and do the balance. And that's also true for work. There are times where that extra cycle from Dave doesn't matter, but there are times where it does. We have a critical sales meeting, and if we ship that feature before the final closing date, we land a 40K deal, like that matters. Or if there's an investor update or a board meeting or whatever it might be, like there might be times where leaning in actually does, and other times where it's okay if I don't push things as hard.
And I'm curious, do you have a ritual or something where every day or every week you reflect and you're like, hey, here are the things that are both important in my personal life and professional life that I should make space for it? Or how do you bake that into your system?
What's worked for me is I have a single note. I still use Evernote, by the way, putting a plug in for Evernote. I think it's actually becoming a great product again. It was like one of the original notes. It got really bad for a while, but they're shipping again and it's great. So I have an Evernote, and the actual title of it is 2024 Guiding Priorities, Goals, and Plans. And within that document, I have like different thematic goals. So this year, for example, I have 6 thematic goals for the year. And then I break down those goals into a few different things, if measurable outcomes, and then like practices. So it's like measurable outcome practices. And I just constantly review those. So for example, as it pertains to this particular conversation, I have a thematic goal, which is be a good husband and father. And I have some practices that I want to make sure I do. One example of a practice is to do bedtimes every weekday night. So I'm always home for bedtime and I read them Harry Potter before bedtime. So I have that on my goal. Even though I like once a year, they're not really like resolutions because even though I do once a year step back and reset the thematic goals, I'll like almost like once a week, I'll review the thematic goals and like tinker with some of the sub details.
Makes a ton of sense. I have to ask, do your kids have any idea what you do?
I think my daughter's figuring out a little bit. She's 6 years old. Yesterday, I was telling her I'm not the mayor because I'm involved in city politics. I sit on this like local commission, and she comes to the meeting sometimes and sees me sitting up on like the dais. She's like, I thought mom said you're the mayor. I'm like, no, I'm not the mayor. Maybe one day, but I'm not the mayor yet. So I don't know. She's trying to figure it out.
And you're in Utah, right?
I am, yeah, in Utah.
Which part of Utah?
I live in a city called Provo. It's a little bit south of Salt Lake.
Got it. You know, I've been seeing a kind of like a positive kind of explosion in Utah tech. And maybe it's been happening for a while and I just wasn't exposed to it. But I feel like in recent years, I've really seen the last company I was working with, Continuum, was a Pelion portfolio company.
Nice,
so
nice.
I got exposed to some of the Utah tech through there. And I'm actually working with another Pelion portfolio company now as an advisor. So I made my way to their massive new building that they built in Utah. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on what do you think is contributing to this like explosion in this tech scene in Utah at the moment?
It's a number of factors. Again, sitting armchair theory here. Well, one is we've had a couple wins. Like it's always good to have a couple big wins to anchor the ecosystem. Like we had way back in the day, WordPerfect. Then we had Omniture. I'm not sure if you remember that company, but it was like a marketing analytics firm that sold to Adobe. Josh James, who like ran, if you heard of Domo, it was like his company before Domo. Then we had Qualtrics. Probably the biggest win so far was like a multi-billion-dollar exit to SAP. So every win has launched a new sort of vintage of companies from the people that were either directly involved and had an exit. So I think that has helped a lot. I think local universities. We have some really strong local universities that I think are accessible. Honestly, I think what's really nice is because they're not that crazy expensive. I think my 2 cents, and maybe this isn't right, maybe someone could look at data and tell me I'm wrong, but universities that are like super expensive, I think it's actually harder to start a company coming out of them because like you have this massive debt where you're like, I have to go work at McKinsey or else I'm never going to get out of this debt. Whereas if you go to a solid state school, or BYU is actually a especially interesting case above this because BYU is owned by the Mormon Church and it's subsidized by them. And so I graduated from BYU. I came out of school with no debt, and that just gives you so much more freedom to start a business if you want. So we get a lot of entrepreneurship just of people coming right out of college because the state schools are pretty well subsidized and not as expensive as UC schools, from my understanding. And then the BYU also contributes to that. So probably a combination of those things.
Got it. Well, great. Before we ask you two final questions and let you go, because we want to be mindful of your schedule, one thing that Mark and I were talking about recently, and I was talking to a couple other founder friends about it as well, is the process of building conviction. And I just would love to maybe end on how do you think about building conviction and maybe navigating periods where we talked about you're setting goals at the beginning of the year, you're prioritizing your time, you're choosing what to do and what not to do, which features to kill, not to kill. I think underneath all that probably has to exist a level of conviction personally. And I've just been very fascinated with asking people how they build it. So how do you build your conviction these days?
That's a really philosophical question. I like it. Ending philosophical. I think there's different kinds of conviction. I think there's like value-based convictions, which are like, these are my core values, like whatever they might be. Everyone's going to have different ones. But for me, like some of my core values, like responsibility, truth, family. So those are some core values. And I think building your core, like your values convictions, I think is a really a lifelong process of experience, study, socialization, maybe even DNA, if you grew up in a faith tradition. But for me, I spent a lot of time like on those. Luckily, I was fortunate enough to grow up with a faith tradition that put a lot of emphasis on values. And I think while a lot of my values have evolved and aren't necessarily like 100% aligned with everything of my faith tradition, I still have a lot, but I'd say they become my own. But at least it taught me like every Sunday, think about what matters and revisit what matters and reflect on your life and seek inspiration from higher powers or from your spirituality or whatever it might be. So that honestly has worked a lot for me for those core values. On the point of view convictions, these are things like, where do I think the world is going? This is what I think, how people respond to this is what I think is the right move or not. I'd say there's like a three general go-to ways of doing this. Like one is I like to move fast, but when it comes to big decisions, I try to take time with them. I almost try to delay them a little bit longer than necessary if it's an important kind of, to use the one-way door framing, one-way door decision. Like I actually try to get as much perspective as possible before making them. And I get perspective by getting myself outside of the context. So I think by definition, it's hard to get perspective when you're in the context of the decision. So I'll go on a hike. In Utah, we have mountains close by. So I'll go on hikes. I'll spend time with my family. But I try to step back and see it from a different viewpoint and get to the point where I feel a lot of like peace with the decision. Like to me, peace is a big emotion associated with decision. I don't like making huge decisions when I'm feeling uncomfortable with the decision or when I feel restless about it. Like to me, it's I still need to work on this. Like I didn't get there. So that's like my personal process for that. But then again, if it's a two-way door decision that's relatively low stakes, I typically will just make gut calls, honestly, or like whatever like the first pass of the data suggests.
Things moving, especially if you're a bottleneck, you don't want to.
And most decisions are two-way, right? I think a lot of decisions are like ship it and learn. Like that's like one of my like main principles, like ship it and learn. That being said, there are decisions where, like I said, they really do matter and they're one-way door, and those ones are ones I actually try to delay uncomfortably. So it's like a bimodal process.
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. I'm sure we could keep going for hours if we had the time.
It's been fun.
As we wrap, I would love to tell our audience, one, where can they go if they want to learn more about you and about Grain? And two, what can they do to be helpful to you?
Yeah, so if people want to learn about grain.com, super easy to find. If you want to learn about me, LinkedIn's probably the best. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, shoot me a message. I'm pretty responsive to my LinkedIn messages. To be helpful, just connect with me. Let's chat. And I think generally the number one things I care about right now is like building a great product and getting more users on that product. So if you want to try Grain and give me feedback, that's super helpful.
One plug for people listening, if you're on the fence about trying it out, I think the free tier of Grain is actually one of the best free tiers I've used. That you
Nice.
get full value of the product for, what is it, like up to 20 calls or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, so it's great. I'm just plugging your product way too hard
Thank
right now,
you,
but
Ben.
hopefully people like it. Anyways, thank you so much for joining us, Jeff. Really
Yeah,
enjoyed
it's
the
been
conversation.
awesome. Likewise.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Ben.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone who you think would benefit from it as well. We really appreciate it. We'd also love a follow or a rating on Substack, Spotify, or YouTube. That's going to let other people find us. And if you have any topic recommendations for a future episode, please send myself or Mark a DM on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.